Well, I have to tell you, first of all, thank you so much, many of you, for having welcomed me back to your YouTube experience, for whatever that may be worth. It was most curious, most interesting. Many people responded to all kinds of parallel trains of thought, which I, in some sense, to which I alluded in my conversation yesterday. And one of them was, and so let me give this in a rambling sort of sense. And some of you are going to say, well, what the hell's wrong with him? And some of you are going to say, I hope. This touches upon many things that he conversed with us about yesterday. And this is how his little pea brain works. And this is how he gets to the intuitive sense of truth that he has about his world, such as it is. I have several other channels, one of whom I talk to on occasion, and I mentioned to him one of the sources to which I had referred, and he said, well, how do you know that's true? And I don't. And the truth of the matter is, for those of us who look online for sourcing as well as read books, and yes, in fact, I do read books, we recognize that there are limits to what it is to which we can attach truth, if there is such a thing. And I believe that at some level there is. And so at the first level, when one reads something, what I attempt to do, and if you look back at my videos from a long time ago, there was a video called Discernment. And the discernment is taking something in and digesting it and seeing how it feels and matching it with the matrix of knowledge that you already have. And so what I attempt to do with everything I look at is say, well, first of all, does that resonate? Secondly, is it believable? Thirdly, is it consistent with other things that I know? Fourth, do the surroundings of that information carry resonance? That is, if somebody tells me something and they tell me 10 other things to which I find perfect resonance, I give it some credence. If 4 of those things I find faulty or defective or dubious, then I say, well, I'll take that little tidbit under advisement. It is by itself interesting, but I will not attach any truth to it until it connects itself to numerous other things. By the way, somebody said to me on one of the comments, you should stop using your hands and you need to get sleeves on your shirt. It is this. Here's the deal. I'm not selling anything. I don't have any sponsors. I've asked no one to give me Patreon. This is just little old me. And I'm sharing with you my thoughts and ideas in a fashion that is comfortable to me. And if the presentation is more important and less comforting to you than the content, then I'm probably not the guy for you. All right, but I digress. So let me share with you how this works, at least in a thought stream which I had today. So one of the commenters made a comment about King James and the source of the King James Bible and the personage of King James, and the fact that King James may have had a grimoire, which is a book of magical compositions in which there are magical or mystical sources or information, alchemy if you like, and that King James may have actually used that in combination perhaps with the Bible, or may have inculcated some of the source of it in there. I'm not really sure, but I got started on the grimoire, and the grimoire word, for which I had no prior understanding, took me to a website by a person named Mistelberger. And if you like, I'll share that. I'll put that just in the notes below here. And went into grimoires of old magic and how they matched up and how they fit into the 13, 14, 1500s, how many of them were alluded to go back to Roman times or to early Christian times to validate themselves for Catholicism and to keep themselves from being banned. Remember that in the 15 and 1600s we are post-printing. We're post, what's the Bible? And we are looking at people trying to come up with knowledge both pre-scientific and mystical kinds of knowledge to understand in an alchemic way what our universe is about. And many times there are people that say, well, these alchemists, these magicians, these people were dark, and some of them were. And we're going to get into that a little bit later, and an interesting comparison between two modern day so-called alchemists. And some of them were not. I mean, some of them were highly sourced people. I would say to you that Leonardo da Vinci and Isaac Newton both looked at alchemy as a source of information. And I suspect, and let me not be saying I'm trying to put me in their company, that they did similarly to what I did, is they take things with a grain of salt, toss it onto the table, to use the metaphor, to mix the metaphor, and then keep playing with things until the pile forms, or the spirals, or the rings, or the threads connect in a way that makes sense. So I looked at these various kinds of grimoires and the source of them, and the fact that they were being communicated throughout Europe in the 13, 14, 1500s, and that some of them were both magical, which is they used occult magic, black magic, white magic, mystical in the sense that they were spiritual, and cryptographic in the sense that they looked to understand and decode certain kinds of source materials for which we look. And I will use various kinds of sources for that. Let's take the Sumerian text. Let's go to Kramer and Sitchin and others that look to the Sumerian text, going clear back now 5,000-6,000 years, looking at 1 million or more clay tablets and some of the source material for which we find information in the Old Testament, for instance, and the Abrahamic legends that ended up as part of the Genesis and the rest of the outset of the Bible, the deluge, the pre-deluge, and some of the things that Abraham may well have learned when he was born, after he was born in Ur, in Babylonia, in Mesopotamia, and in the area of Iraq now, before he migrated first to Egypt and then further west, or further east, excuse me. So we have to take a look at those. We also take a look at, if you take a look at the Diehold Foundation, there's a gentleman there who I think is a geologist, and I'm going to reference him again in other ways, in other conversations, and he is attempting to decrypt what he considers to be the original Hebraic symbols, and takes what Moses and others have said and said, well, this is what they said in cryptography, this is what they really meant. And I think there's some validation to that. And it goes to a totally different subject, which has to do with the deluge and the macrocosmic impact of the deluge, and it is periodicity, if there's such a word, how often it is the periodic form of a replication of those kinds of events might happen, as well as other information that relates to it. So if I haven't lost every single one of you, let me proceed. So the grimoire took me to a variety of things, including books on and information on the term abracadabra, which has to do with mundane forms of magic and people using it in place of magic. I mean, it's literally one tick from the from rubbing a rabbit foot kind of thing, and then talking about how abracadabra has been misused and misaligned, not to say that it's good or bad, and that people even like Aleister Crowley, who is a dark black sort of magical artist, and who goes clear back into the Masonic stuff, the post-Masonic stuff, the quasi-Sabbatian sort of misactivity, exhausting sexual activity, lacking inhibitions, failing to use spiritually inclined conduct to contain himself in order to exhaust his energy and to theoretically come to a more spiritually connected, dark sort of way. So here's Aleister Crowley. And then I get to, again, this Mistelberger talking about why remarkable people rarely meet. And what he ended up doing was, if it's a he, this P.T. Mistelberger, was comparing a couple of meetings allegedly between Aleister Crowley and Gurdjieff, who is the white supposed alchemist, as opposed to the dark Aleister Crowley, who came to Gurdjieff in the 20s, allegedly in 24 and again in 26, and the stories about them having had an unpleasant parting, perhaps, as a result of that, and comparing that then to Osho and Krishnamurti and how they interacted, and whether or not persons would want to make a spiritual trip alone or with a guru. And the explanation of a trip with a guru, and I use that in the broadest sense of the word, advisors, preachers, ministers, pathway advisors, and everybody from the Dalai Lama to the gurus of the Buddhist temples to some of these charismatic preachers. And what the author advises us is that people who try to see themselves in connection, and Osho apparently did this, was to put an amulet of himself that people wore and to encourage them to connect to him, as many Buddhists do, to bring them into taking them out of the duality of existence and into a singularity of existence, which includes others or other objects or other people, with the idea that they gain access to their spirituality through that process. Now, I'm not going to do that, and I can't do that, and I can't stand the idea of doing that, to give myself over to somebody else in that sense, that is, to see them as the source material of it. The parallel of that is to use that guru as a sourcing material for breaking down the duality, the ego, and the rest of that sense, is to see oneself in connection with the higher spiritual sense. And we're going to see, if I share with you some of the kinds of things that I've talked about. There's Nassim Haramein talking about photons and Plancks and the entire connectivity of the universe, which intimates the potentiality for its holographic nature, which would in sense make the outside universe all inside and make us all one. And so it is by connecting to the guru, by connecting to the higher self, by connecting to the source, by connecting to God, one gets connection with the universe and with himself out beyond his own egoistic potentiality, right? And so people take a spiritual walk, and they use that spiritual walk to try to break down or separate or seek a higher plane. And this goes to all kinds of various disciplines to follow through. So finally I came in looking at Gurdjieff and his life and the Wikipedic sources of it, and how he survived the death of his wife and others and some calamities, and his volatile personality and the polarity between him and other gurus and some of his followings. And then in the 40s, after World War II was concluded, he gained access to, had another car accident and was frail in health, I think, and then was advised and encouraged to go see Lasso, the Lasso Cave, right? And this is another source of study that I have spent a bunch of time on, and it has to do with whether or not these cave drawings are simply primitive man in his first artistic endeavors, or whether those Lasso caves and Chavo and others represent the spirituality of caveman in a much deeper sense, and their connectivity again to the oneness of the universe, and the sense by some of them that these different animal forms provide different energy sources, and that the more advanced drawings of the cave drawings were actually the transpositional energies of these entities exposing themselves to the rock and becoming present to the person in a spiritual connectivity with his higher self, his or her higher self, to see a spiritual connectivity and a breakdown again of the duality of life, and seeing all of us as part of the same source of information. So when I get all done, I've come full circle. Now, let me give a final note, which has to do with a lot of these kinds of things, both as it relates to the caves, which are both perhaps pre and post-Diluvian, that have to do with some of the cultures that may have survived around pre and post-Diluvian cultures, and also the fact that the Diluvian aspects of it itself may or may not have spiritual implications. I would ask you to take a look at the Diehold Foundation, which I think is curiously interesting, and I'm most interested in his analysis, his geological analysis of the periodicity of a Diluvian event which may have happened 12,500 years ago, and that it may in fact be loading to replicate. Some of you will say biblically that, well, that's obviously the revelation source, and that kinds of things going to happen. Some others will say that it is perhaps related to a more cosmic presence or mechanical presence, and the source of Atlantis and the Plato writings go back, I think, to his uncle that talked to an Egyptian who told him that you have some record or input about a deluge. And the deluge, in fact, happened. But the deluge, both fire and water events, are periodic. It wasn't a singular event. And it probably was not, some kind of a low-level puddle or a Mediterranean flood, as some suggest it was, but that it may have been worldwide, and that it couples with, or may be in parallel to, tandem with, or randomly likely to happen as with solar flares, which are the fire. So we have deluges and flares, EMP events, that may actually happen on some kind of periodic basis. And that this source of Atlantis said, well, Atlantis was destroyed by a periodic flood, not by just a single event, but a periodic flood. Which takes me around again to the Diehold Foundation, and finally to the other source of the information, which is that secretly and quietly, Isaac Newton studied, and he looked at the Old Testament. He looked at translating out the Hebrew. He did much as the Diehold Foundation guy has done, and he looked at the timetables and what he thought was going to happen with the potential to have a deluge again, and came up with roughly the same kind of prediction that sometime between 2020 and 2150 or so, there would be another deluge event. I'm going to talk more about why and how I think a deluge happens, and basically, except for Diehold and perhaps Isaac Newton, I don't agree with any of the great scholars on this information, which tells you either that I don't know what the hell I'm talking about, or maybe I have a different thought about it. So, some of you asked for the nature of my mental ramblings. You have just gotten a taste of it for what it is worth. Thank you so much for watching. Again, if some of this is of interest to you, please share your own input, because as you can see, Grimoire took me through a morning of research, some of which matched the rest of what I've been doing for the last 50 years, and some of it was totally new information or added extra niblets to the total meal. Thank you so much for watching. If you like, give a thumbs up. Hey, it is a spiritual journey, whether we see it that way or not. Thanks so much for watching.